Welcome. Today we are going to talk about a war that lasted longer than most people live. It stretched across more than a century, involved generations of kings and soldiers, and fundamentally changed two of the most powerful countries in Europe. We are talking about the 100 Years' War between England and France.
100 years of war. That is almost impossible to imagine. How does a war last that long?
That is one of the most interesting questions we will explore today, because it was not one continuous battle. It was a long series of conflicts, truces, betrayals, plagues, and political crises that kept pulling the two kingdoms back into fighting. It started in 1337 and ended in 1453. That is 116 years.
So it was even longer than 100 years.
It was. And during those 116 years, the world changed dramatically. The way wars were fought changed. The way people thought about themselves and their country changed. And out of all that suffering and struggle, something new emerged. The idea of England as England and France as France, two distinct nations with their own identities.
So the war helped create the countries we know today.
In a very real sense, yes. Nations are not born naturally. They are built, often through shared struggle and shared suffering. And the 100 Years' War gave both England and France exactly that. Let us begin at the beginning, with a question about a crown.
So how did the war start? Was there a single event that triggered it?
Like most long conflicts, the war had roots that went back decades before the actual fighting began. But the immediate cause was a question that seems almost simple on the surface. Who should be the king of France?
That does not sound like something that would start a war lasting over a century.
It does not, until you understand how deeply complicated medieval kingship was. In 1328, the French king Charles IV died without a male heir. The direct line of the French royal family had ended, and suddenly several powerful people had potential claims to the French throne.
Including the English king?
Yes. The English king at the time was Edward III. His mother was Isabella of France, the sister of the late French king. That meant Edward was the nephew of Charles IV. Through his mother, he argued, he had a legitimate claim to the French crown.
But the French did not accept that.
The French nobility rejected his claim immediately. They cited an old legal tradition called Salic law, which held that the right to rule could not be passed through a female line. By that reasoning, Edward's claim through his mother was invalid. Instead, the French crown went to Philip of Valois, a cousin of the late king through the male line, who became Philip VI.
So Edward was told his claim did not count.
And he accepted that, at least initially. But the relationship between England and France was already deeply complicated by something else entirely. Large parts of what is now southwestern France, a region called Gascony, were under English control. The English king held this land, but as a feudal vassal of the French king. That meant Edward technically owed loyalty and service to Philip.
So the King of England had to bow to the King of France for land he controlled in France.
Exactly. And this created constant tension. Philip used his feudal authority to interfere in Gascony, supporting local lords who opposed English control. He also supported Scotland, which was frequently in conflict with England. From Edward's perspective, the French king was undermining him at every turn.
So the frustration kept building.
Until 1337, when Philip announced that Gascony was confiscated and returned to direct French control. Edward responded by formally renewing his claim to the French throne. He declared himself the rightful king of France, and with that declaration, the war began.
So it started with a legal argument about inheritance.
It started with inheritance and land and feudal obligations. But underneath all of that was something simpler and more powerful. Two proud kingdoms, each believing they had the right to control their own destiny. found themselves locked in a relationship where one was expected to be subordinate to the other. That kind of tension does not resolve itself peacefully.
And so it resolved itself over 116 years of war instead.
Wars often begin where diplomacy runs out of room, when the legal arguments and the political maneuvering stop producing results, and when both sides have enough pride and enough resources to fight, the fighting begins. In this case, it began over a crown, a region of land, and a century of accumulated grievances between two neighboring kingdoms that were far too entangled with each other to simply separate.
It sounds like the war was almost inevitable, given how complicated their relationship was.
Many historians believe it was. When two powerful neighbors share borders, share history, share royal bloodlines, and yet compete for the same resources and authority, conflict has a way of becoming not a matter of if, but when.
Once the war started, how did the actual fighting unfold? What made this war different from earlier medieval conflicts?
The most revolutionary thing about the 100 Years' War was what happened to the idea of the knight. For centuries, the mounted knight in full armor had been the dominant force on the medieval battlefield. A trained knight on a heavy war horse, covered in steel, was an incredibly powerful weapon. Battles were often decided by charges of armored cavalry crashing into enemy lines.
So before this war, knights were the most important soldiers.
They were the elite. Warfare was built around them, and there was a whole cultural system, called chivalry, that celebrated the knight as the ideal warrior and nobleman. To be a knight was to represent the highest values of medieval society: courage, loyalty, honor, and skill in combat.
And the 100 Years' War changed that.
It destroyed it, and the instrument of destruction was a simple piece of wood about 2 meters long, the English longbow.
A wooden bow brought down the age of knights.
It sounds almost impossible, but yes. The English longbow was an extraordinary weapon. It was made from yew wood, carefully shaped so that the inner part of the wood, which is more elastic, faced the archer, and the outer part, which is stronger under tension, faced away. This combination gave the bow tremendous power.
How far could it shoot?
A skilled archer could shoot accurately at targets over 200 meters away. And the arrows, called bodkin arrows, had long, narrow steel tips, specifically designed to punch through metal armor. An arrow fired from a longbow at close to medium range could penetrate the plate armor of a knight.
So the armor that was supposed to protect the knight could be pierced by an arrow.
Not always, and not from every angle or distance. But the longbow changed the calculation dramatically, and the English trained their longbowmen from childhood. It took years to develop the strength and skill to use the longbow effectively. The muscles of an experienced English archer were often visibly asymmetric, more developed on the drawing arm and shoulder from years of daily practice.
So it required a lifetime of training.
Almost. And the results were devastating. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was one of the first clear demonstrations of what longbowmen could do. The French army was vastly larger than the English force. The French had thousands of mounted knights, the finest cavalry in Europe. But Edward III positioned his longbowmen carefully on a hillside and waited.
What happened when the French charged?
The French cavalry charged uphill into a storm of arrows. Thousands of arrows per minute were released by the English archers. Horses went down. Knights fell. The charge broke apart before it could reach the English lines. The French attacked again and again, over a dozen times according to some accounts, and each time the longbowmen tore the charge apart. The English won decisively despite being heavily outnumbered.
And this happened again later in the war.
It happened again at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, in even more dramatic circumstances. The English army under King Henry V was exhausted, hungry, and heavily outnumbered by a fresh French force. The ground was wet and muddy from recent rain. The French knights, in full heavy armor, had to advance across a narrow muddy field toward the English position.
Heavy armor and deep mud. That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
It was. The knights sank into the mud with every step. Moving became exhausting, and as they struggled forward, the English longbowmen released their arrows. Knights fell and could not get up. Others tripped over the fallen bodies. The mud held them in place while arrows continued to fall. By the end of the battle, thousands of French knights were dead, and the English losses were minimal.
So the most expensive, most trained, most celebrated soldiers of the era were defeated by archers with wooden bows.
And that sent a message that echoed through European military thinking for generations. The age of the mounted knight as the decisive force in battle was ending. What mattered now was positioning, tactics, discipline, and the ability to use ranged weapons effectively. War was becoming less about individual heroism and more about organized, coordinated forces working together.
That sounds like the beginning of modern military thinking.
It is exactly that. The battles of the 100 Years' War helped push warfare away from the romantic ideal of knight, against knight and toward the disciplined professional armies that would define the modern era. The longbow did not just win battles. It changed the entire concept of what war was.
We have been talking about kings and battles and military tactics. But what was happening to ordinary people during all of this?
This is a part of the story that does not get enough attention. While kings argued over crowns and knights fought on battlefields, the people who suffered most were the ordinary men, women and children who had no say in any of it. And their suffering came from two directions at once.
Two directions?
The war itself and the plague. In 1347, right in the middle of the early phase of the conflict, a devastating disease arrived in Europe from the east. We call it the Black Death. It was almost certainly bubonic plague, spread by fleas carried on rats. It moved through Europe with terrifying speed, and it killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of Europe within just a few years.
A third to half of all people in Europe.
In some regions, even more. Entire villages were emptied. Cities lost half their populations in months. There was no understanding of what caused it or how to stop it. People watched their families die one by one and had no explanation and no remedy. The fear and the grief were overwhelming.
And this was happening at the same time as the war.
Yes, France, as the main battlefield of the conflict, suffered especially badly. And the war brought its own particular form of destruction beyond the actual battles. Both English and French armies of this period regularly practiced something called the chevauchée. This was a deliberate military strategy of raiding and destroying the countryside.
What did that involve exactly?
Soldiers would move through a region, burning farms, destroying crops, killing livestock, and taking whatever food and valuables they could carry. The purpose was not simply cruelty, though it often became that. The strategic goal was to deny resources to the enemy, to undermine the enemy, king's authority by showing that he could not protect his own people, and to weaken the economic base that supported the enemy's army.
So ordinary farmers and villagers were being deliberately targeted.
Their livelihoods were being destroyed as a military tactic. A family that had spent years building a farm, raising animals, storing grain, could lose everything in an afternoon when a raiding party passed through. And then they faced starvation, especially through winter. This happened repeatedly in the same regions, year after year.
That kind of repeated destruction must have been psychologically devastating as well.
Deeply so. There are accounts from this period of entire regions of France where the fields went unplanted because the farmers had fled or died, where villages stood empty, where the roads were dangerous and travel nearly impossible. A French poet of the time wrote about traveling through regions that had once been prosperous and finding only silence and ruins.
It sounds like the war turned large parts of France into a wasteland.
In some areas, essentially, yes. And this prolonged suffering had an unexpected effect. When people share extreme hardship together, when they all suffer from the same enemy, something can begin to grow among them. A sense of shared identity, a feeling of we, of belonging to the same group, of having the same enemy and the same fate.
So the suffering started to create a feeling of being French.
Before this war, most ordinary people in France identified primarily with their local region, their village, their lord. A peasant in Normandy did not think of himself as sharing a deep identity with a peasant in Burgundy. They spoke different dialects, followed different local lords, and had little connection to each other.
But the war changed that.
Slowly, yes. When the same English soldiers burned your village and your neighbor's village and the village beyond that, when the same plague swept through your region, when the same distant king seemed unable or unwilling to protect you, people began to feel a broader solidarity. The enemy was not just attacking your lord, it was attacking something larger, something that included all of you.
So the idea of France as a nation was born partly out of shared pain.
Nations often are. Shared suffering creates bonds that prosperity alone cannot. The French people did not choose this identity consciously. It grew from the experience of living through the same catastrophe together, generation after generation, for over a century. And that growing sense of collective identity would eventually produce one of the most extraordinary figures in all of European history.
You mean Joan of Arc?
I mean a teenage girl from a small village who somehow changed the course of a war that had been going on for nearly 100 years.
How does a teenage girl from a village end up leading an army?
That is the question that has fascinated people for 600 years. And the honest answer is that we still do not fully understand it. What we know is this. By around 1428, France was in a desperate situation. The English, in alliance with the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, controlled most of northern France, including Paris. The French crown prince, Charles, had not even been officially crowned as king. He was a weak figure, uncertain of himself, with little territory and little support.
So France was close to being completely defeated.
Very close. And at this moment, a girl named Joan arrived. She was from a village called Domremy in eastern France. She was around 17 years old. She had no military training, no political connections, and no obvious reason why anyone should listen to her. But she told people that she had been hearing the voices of saints, and that God had given her a mission to drive the English out of France and see Charles crowned as the true king.
And people believed her?
Not immediately. She had to fight very hard just to be taken seriously. She first approached the local military commander and was turned away. She came back and was turned away again. She came back a third time, and something about her persistence and her absolute certainty began to make an impression. She was eventually sent to meet Charles himself.
What happened when she met him?
According to accounts, Charles tried to test her by disguising himself among his courtiers, letting someone else sit on the throne. Joan is said to have walked directly to the real Charles without hesitation and addressed him correctly. Whether this story is literally true or has grown in the retelling, it made a powerful impression on the people around him.
Charles decided to trust her.
He gave her a chance. She was given armor, a horse, and soldiers, and she was sent to Orleans, a strategically crucial city that the English had been besieging for months. The fall of Orleans would have opened the road to the remaining French-held territory in the south. It was a critical moment.
What did Joan actually do at Orleans? Did she fight?
She fought, and she was wounded by an arrow during the campaign. But her impact went far beyond her physical actions on the battlefield. What Joan brought to the French forces was something that military commanders cannot manufacture or order. She brought belief. She carried an absolute, unwavering certainty that God was on their side and that they would win.
And that changed how the soldiers fought.
Completely. French forces had been demoralized by years of defeats and retreats. They had stopped believing they could win. Joan did not change the weapons or the tactics dramatically. She changed the psychological state of the army. Soldiers who had been hesitant and fearful began to fight with a new intensity. The siege of Orleans was broken within days of her arrival.
That is remarkable. One person's belief transforming an entire army.
Military historians recognize this as a real phenomenon. Morale is not a soft or secondary factor in warfare. It is often the decisive factor. An army that believes it will win fights differently from one that expects to lose. Joan understood this instinctively, even if she would not have described it in those terms. She simply believed, completely and publicly, and her belief was contagious.
What happened after Orleans?
Joan pushed forward aggressively. She led the French forces in a series of rapid military successes, moving quickly before the English could regroup. Within a few months, she had cleared the way for Charles to travel to Reims, which was the traditional city where French kings were crowned. And in July 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France, with Joan standing beside him in full armor.
She achieved both of her stated goals: drive back the English and crown the king.
In less than a year from her first arrival at the French court. But her story did not end there, and the ending was painful. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces during a military engagement and sold to the English. She was put on trial for heresy and witchcraft, charges that were largely politically motivated. The trial was designed to discredit her and, by extension, to undermine the legitimacy of Charles, whose coronation she had made possible.
And Charles did not try to rescue her.
He made no serious effort to save her. This is one of the most troubling aspects of the whole story. The king whose crown she had secured essentially abandoned her. Joan was convicted and burned at the stake in 1431. She was 19 years old.
19. She changed the course of a century-long war and was dead at 19.
25 years after her death, a retrial was held, and she was formally declared innocent. And centuries later, she was made a saint by the Catholic Church. But in the moment, she died alone, abandoned by the king she had served, executed by the enemies she had fought.
Her story is almost impossible to process. So much courage, such a short life, such a betrayal at the end.
And yet her impact on the war was permanent. The momentum she created, the crowned king she secured, the belief she restored in French forces could not be undone by her death. The tide of the war had turned. France would not turn back.
After Joan of Arc, how did the war finally end? The French still had decades of fighting ahead of them.
Yes, Joan's contribution was decisive in terms of morale and legitimacy, but the war continued for another 20 years after her death. What finished it was not a single heroic figure this time. It was a systematic transformation of how France made war.
What changed?
Two things, working together. First, France created something that had not really existed before in medieval Europe in this form: a permanent professional army paid directly by the king. Before this, armies were assembled from feudal obligations. Lords brought their knights and soldiers when called upon, and they went home when the campaign ended. This system was unreliable, slow, and difficult to control.
So the French king built an army that belonged to him directly.
Charles VII, the same king Joan had crowned, pushed through a series of military reforms in the 1440s. He established companies of professional soldiers who were paid regular wages, trained consistently, and available year-round. This was a standing army in the modern sense. It was loyal to the crown, not to individual lords, and it could be deployed quickly whenever needed.
That sounds like a fundamental change in how power worked.
It was. A king with a permanent army did not have to negotiate with his nobles every time he wanted to fight. He did not have to wait for feudal levies to assemble. He could act independently and decisively. This shifted the balance of power significantly toward the central authority of the crown and away from the feudal nobility.
And the second change was the weapons.
Gunpowder artillery. Cannons had existed for some time before this, but they were slow, unreliable, and difficult to move. French engineers and commanders, particularly two brothers named Jean and Gaspard Bureau, developed a new generation of artillery that was lighter, more accurate, and could be transported and positioned much more effectively than earlier cannon designs.
How did cannons change the war?
They changed it completely. The entire strategic advantage of the English in France had rested on two things: their longbowmen in open battle, and the English held castles and fortified towns that gave them secure bases throughout French territory. Castles were extremely difficult and costly to capture by conventional means. A well-supplied castle with determined defenders could hold out for months or even years against a besieging army.
But cannons could break castle walls.
Cannons could destroy them. Stone walls that had protected fortifications for centuries crumbled under sustained artillery bombardment. Suddenly, the hundreds of English held castles and fortified positions across France were vulnerable in a way they had never been before. The French artillery moved systematically from position to position, and the English strongholds fell one after another.
So the English lost their safe bases throughout France.
They lost them rapidly. The campaign of reconquest in the early 1450s moved with a speed that would have been impossible in the earlier phases of the war. The combination of a disciplined professional army and effective mobile artillery proved overwhelming. Town after town, castle after castle surrendered or fell.
What was the final battle?
The Battle of Castillon in 1453 is generally considered the final major engagement of the war. An English army attempted to relieve a besieged French-held town and attacked the French position. But the French had positioned their artillery carefully, and when the English advanced, they were hit by concentrated cannon fire. The English commander, John Talbot, who had been one of the most feared English military leaders of the entire war, was killed. The English army was destroyed, and with that defeat, English military power in France effectively collapsed.
And after 116 years, the war was over.
With no formal peace treaty, which is one of the unusual aspects of how it ended. The fighting simply stopped because England no longer had the forces or the resources to continue, and internal political troubles at home, which would eventually become the Wars of the Roses, consumed English attention. France had won, not with a dramatic final ceremony, but by grinding the English position down to nothing.
What did England have left in France after all of that?
Only the port city of Calais, which England held for another century before finally losing that too. After 116 years of war, after generations of soldiers and kings and common people had fought and suffered and died, England's vast territorial holdings in France had been reduced to a single port town.
That is an extraordinary reversal from where things started.
It is, and it had profound consequences for both countries. For France, the expulsion of the English forced the country to look inward and consolidate. The king now had a professional army, a more centralized administration, and a population that had developed a shared sense of French identity through a century of shared struggle. France emerged from the war as a more unified, more centralized, and more distinctly national state than it had been before.
And for England?
England's loss of its French territories forced a similar process of redefinition. For centuries, English kings had thought of themselves as rulers of lands on both sides of the English Channel. The great English nobility had estates in France. The royal family had deep French roots. French was still spoken at the English court. Losing France forced England to become more fully itself, an island nation with its own distinct identity and its own future to build.
So both countries became more themselves by losing their connection to each other.
That is a very precise way to put it. The war that began because the two kingdoms were too entangled with each other ended by separating them into two distinct and self-contained nations. England became England. France became France. The boundaries that had been blurry and contested for centuries were now clear, and both peoples knew which side of them they stood on.
And the feudal system that had caused so many of the original problems. What happened to that?
It did not survive the war in any meaningful form. The standing armies, the centralized royal authority, the use of professional soldiers paid in wages rather than feudal obligations, all of these developments undermined the foundations of feudal society. A noble's value to his king had always rested on the soldiers and resources he could provide. When the king had his own army and his own revenues, he no longer needed the nobility in the same way.
So the nobles lost power.
Gradually but steadily. The kings of France and England in the decades after the war were far more powerful relative to their nobles than their predecessors had been at the start of the conflict. The war had accelerated the transition from medieval feudalism toward the centralized monarchies that would define European politics for the next several centuries.
So the 100 Years' War did not just end a conflict. It ended an entire way of organizing society.
The medieval world, as it had existed in the 12th and 13th centuries, did not survive the 14th and 15th. The Black Death, the religious upheavals, and above all this long and grinding war. Together, they broke apart the old structures and made space for something new. The modern nation-state, the professional army, centralized government, a sense of national rather than purely local identity. All of these things grew stronger through the experience of the 100 Years' War.
It is strange to think that so much destruction could produce so much that we still recognize in the world today.
History rarely moves forward cleanly. The things we value most often emerge from periods of tremendous difficulty and loss. The nations of England and France that exist today were shaped in fundamental ways by 116 years of war, plague, famine, and suffering. That does not make the suffering worthwhile, but it does mean the suffering was not without consequence.
Looking back across everything, what strikes you most about the 100 Years' War?
What strikes me most is how it shows the distance between the reasons wars start and the consequences they produce. This war began over a legal argument about who had the right to sit on the French throne. It ended by creating two modern nations and dismantling the entire social order of medieval Europe. Nobody at the beginning could have predicted or intended those outcomes.
The people who started it had no idea what they were really starting.
They never do. Wars begin with specific grievances and specific goals. But once they are set in motion, they generate consequences that nobody planned and nobody controls. The longbow changed warfare. The plague changed society. Joan of Arc changed what people believed was possible. The cannon changed the relationship between offense and defense. None of these things were part of Edward III's calculation when he declared himself King of France in 1337.
And ordinary people paid the price for all of it.
They always do. The kings and the nobles made the decisions. The farmers and the soldiers and the villagers bore the cost. That is the part of the story that the dramatic accounts of battles and heroic figures can sometimes obscure. Behind every famous victory and every famous defeat, there were thousands of people who simply tried to survive, and very often did not.
Joan of Arc reminds us of that too. The most important figure in the whole war was not a king or a general. She was a teenage girl from a village.
History has a way of being shaped by people who were not supposed to matter. Joan had no title, no land, no army, no political authority. She had belief and courage and an extraordinary ability to make other people feel what she felt. And she changed everything. That is worth remembering the next time someone tells you that individuals cannot change the course of history.
The 100 Years' War. It gave us two nations, ended one world, and began another.
And left us with questions that still matter today. About what makes a nation. About who pays the real cost of war. About where history ends and legend begins. Thank you for joining us for this journey across a century of blood, steel, and transformation.
The war is long over, but everything it built and everything it broke is still with us.
It always is.